And we should be live. Hello everyone. How is everyone doing? I'm gonna say this right now. I might have to get up at some point in the stream because I currently have my dog sitting on the bed near where I do my streaming, and she's licking herself, and she has a tendency to just decide to up sticks and move whenever she wants. She's not the most considerate dog on the planet. So I decided that it would be appropriate to use the painting in the background again, the Triumph of the Guillotine, because today we're going to be talking about atheism. I might actually make it a little bit larger if I can, because it's a little bit low res. There we go. I was a little bit slow on the dog does go bark CL. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I was a little bit quick on the starting of the stream because I got bogged down with other things. So here's how I think we should do it, right? Because I'm going to talk a lot about atheism and specifically apatheism. The real problem isn't so much atheism as apatheism, the lack of caring about these sorts of things. So, but before that, I thought I'd take a few questions in because I've got a big plan. Actually, I wrote down in one of my notebooks because I have a lot of notebooks. But I kind of want to get more people in here before I start talking about it. So if you guys want to throw questions here, I'll sort of give you a rundown of what drove me to actually make this stream in the first place. Also, if you could share this and on your social media of whatever variation. And of course my phone decides to go off as the stream starts. Give me a second. That's my alarm for Vespers. But I did my Vespers earlier on, so this always happens. There's always something I'm forgetting, and of course my phone is off, so I can't actually do anything about it. Yeah, okay. So what drove me to do this is that on Facebook I am in a group chat. Yes, I do have a Nokia. This is such a bad way to start a stream. I do this. I think that God does this to remind me of humility. The reason I started this stream is because yesterday I'm in a Facebook group chat with a bunch of people from the political party I used to be in. For those who don't know, I was at UKIP, and I decided that I would talk a little bit about men's mental health, or rather, the abysmal approach to it, and a lot of it was just responding to people with the very typical mainstream opinion of, normalized men talking about their feeling. I think the tweet was something to the extent of normalized men crying, normalized men talking about their feelings, and normalized men's mental health, right? And explaining why this is really not going to go down the way that people think. And of course this did not make people particularly happy, and I said, well, if you want to solve it, you go to confession. You don't go to a counsellor, right? I've been to enough counsellors to know that they don't really work, and a lot of them just offer validation, right? And I'm giving you a very rough rundown of what happened because it's not really essential to the talk itself that I'm going to give here, but I just want to give you an idea of where my brain was turning, right? And of course they just the people in the chat, being relatively average modern people, just assumed that religion was a flavour of ice cream, or maybe that's a little bit reductive, but they think of it as mostly something aesthetic, somewhere nice that you go on Sunday, as opposed to something that is supposed to provide an entire worldview. So that's what ultimately drove me to do this stream. So I'm just gonna see questions. So I've got 42 people in here. If you guys could share it. Obviously I don't tend to get notifications anymore with these sorts of streams. I'm not sure I understand why, but hey ho, it's what it is. If people want me to talk about the mental health question in more detail later on in the stream, I will. George Washington asked, is there any full-time job for someone who's just a bachelor's in history and that could allow him to support himself and his family? Well, I mean, we're at a point economically where you could get a job in an office, but really you'd probably have to do your own side hustle on top of that. But yeah, NLP, I assume you mean natural language processing by that, Felix. I'm actually probably going to do my dissertation on NLP. It's very interesting. I'm thinking of playing around with Tacotron 2 and stuff like that. Speech synthesis, for those who don't know. You know the funny bot that does JFK. You know the video where JFK goes there. They targeted gamers, right? That I'm looking into improving that technology. Yeah, so I think now is a good time to talk about. First of all, we're going to talk about the consequences of atheism and apatheism, and then we're going to talk about the root of it, the root of the whole problem, and why it is in fact a problem. Now, of course, for those who don't understand traditional religion, meaning Hinduism, to an extent Islam, Christianity, Judaism, etc., the way that religion is taught and the way that religion is generally held in the Anglosphere, and this is just as much the fault of Protestantism as it is the fault of Protestantism in terms of the reformers, obviously not the practitioners themselves necessarily, but it's just as much of a problem with Protestantism as it is with modernism, that there is a reduction on the emphasis on the totalizing aspect of religion, right? And that's because Protestantism and modernism have a very light grasp on actual interior belief. Protestants call it the doctrine of private judgment. We don't really have a name for it in the modern times. We just kind of, I suppose you just call it, it's your opinion, bro. And this has been a disaster. This has been a complete disaster. By the way, I can see a lot of people asking me questions. If you want to tag me, so I can, when I end the kind of talk, I can, I can see them. That would be much appreciated. So, the real problem with this is this internal conception of truth. So, for those who don't know, there are many people who don't have a very good grasp on what the word truth actually means or what truth actually is. And that's understandable, right? We're not taught it in schools. It's a philosophical concept. We're kind of expected to intuitively know it, but really most people don't because they don't spend their time thinking about it. Now, that's how we can have things like subjective truth, and there was a Democratic politician who once said, we don't care about your facts, we care about the truth. Right? This kind of very subjectivist take on truth. No, that's not what truth is. Truth is how far the human mind corresponds to reality in the way it thinks. So, for example, I can think that 2 + 2 is 5 mentally. But it doesn't correspond to reality. We know that in reality that 2 + 2 = 4. This isn't an argument. This is just there's no argument to really justify that. And the dog's gone to sit down. I'll have to get her in a second. Veritas, as Dawson says. Now the problem is that over the last 400 years, this conception of truth has become more and more internalized. It's always been a constant presence in history, but over the last 400 years, it's really gained sway in a way that it never had before. And because people intuitively have a tendency to be more interested in the results than in the genealogy of those ideas and in the actual technical logic, I'll just give you the results first. This is the results of atheism and apatheism, generally speaking. The first one is the destruction of virtue as a concept. Because if there's no God, or you're very agnostic on what God is, you don't even know what good habits are, because virtues are habits that build up the human being, right? Now, some of the early Enlightenment figures had this conception, and they tried to imitate classical virtue, but even then, classical virtue was an incredibly rare thing. They set themselves up in the tradition of Cicero and Sallust and Sulla and Marius. But at the same time, these people, I'm not sure if they were ignorant, but I would hope they were ignorant of the fact that in the classical world things were very brutal. Cicero, of course, died when he was nailed. When he was dead, when he was killed, he was nailed to the door of the Senate with his head cut off. Likewise, Mithridates of Pontus carried out genocides against Roman settlers in what is now modern-day Turkey, the part that was once Greece. But that's more of an issue of it not being taught. It isn't so much reliant on this internal conception of truth. This the list of things that I've got here. I've got a very, very long list here of things that have resulted from this internal conception of truth. This hewing of the human mind and its conception of truth from objective exterior material and immaterial reality. The destruction of marriage. The destruction of objective standards of behaviour, good, that being good and bad. The tyranny of pathos even. The destruction of meaningful education. The atomization of society and divergence of societal aims. Of course, if you're trapped inside of yourself and you're an atomized individual, which is ultimately the result of this, and I'll explain why when I talk about intellectual genealogies later on, why. You're going to be swinging off in all sorts of different directions. The championing of word games centered on crude rhetoric, playing on this same pathos, and on ethos rather than logos itself. So, for those who don't know, Sorry, I thought I closed this off. For those who don't know, in rhetoric there are three things that you want to aim for, and I admit I'm not very good at this. You have logos, which is straight truth. You have ethos, which is appealing to, ethical structures, also things like appeals to authority, and then you have pathos, which is appeal to emotion, essentially. Nowadays, we tend to appeal a lot more to pathos and, to a lesser extent, ethos. 2 billion abortions, because, if it's her body and her choice, and there's no objective judgment on what a child is, then, we might as well just murder babies, because we can't even as a society decide on whether or not it is a baby or not, regardless of the actual truth. The constant struggle of ideologies, which build off of the flawed philosophy stated. The three that I've listed here are Marxism, fascism, and materialistic capitalism. The loss of the inherent dignity of man. After all, there is no conception of man as the image of God when there is no God. Of course, if you don't believe in God, if you're an atheist, then you lose the inherent dignity through that. Because, especially with modern material atheism, there's no reason to make a distinction between man and any other material thing, except for how you feel. Now, Christianity and indeed other religions, Judaism, of course, make it very clear why we should, in an objective logical sense as well as a pathological and ethical sense. Guillotines. Lots and lots of guillotines. Is this not the problem when yeah, actually, Nathan, you've nailed it. You've nailed it. But I'll go on to it in due time. The panic, this is one thing I noticed. They panic over religious extremism because they don't recognise the pathology of their own atheism. But the mental health industry is another stream, right? I've already said I can talk about that later on. Now, this is a huge list of different things, right? And I haven't given them necessarily an explanation. That's because I hope that if people can perhaps pay attention to the genealogy of the ideology behind that being the modernism of the 17th century and onward, I'm hoping that it will become evident. Now, what I'm not going to do is give you a huge overbearing explanation of these philosophers, because frankly it's been a very long time since I've read a lot of them, first of all, and second of all because a lot of the stuff is not really that necessary. There's no need to go and explain Kant's Critique of Pure Reason in complete objective detail if I can just give you a 2 or 3 sentence explanation. Kant, more like Kant. Now, like I've said, these assumptions are not universal. They've always existed. But The current iteration begins with the early modernists, the least insane one of them being Descartes. Now, Descartes made a seemingly very small mistake, and a very small assumption, which to the average atheist or apatheist listening, they won't quite understand the implications of it if they don't understand first principles. But it is so exceptionally important, and it's probably one of the biggest intellectual mistakes in modern history. It's led to the creation of sciences that don't really even need to exist. Cognitive science and this assumption that everything is just material comes out of this, and also the strange idealism that came with Kant and others also somewhat spring out of this. Now, Descartes, I believe it's in his first part, his first meditation from the Meditations on First Philosophy, says the very famous phrase, cogito ego ergo sum, or I think, therefore I am. So, he did something that was very different to the intellectual orthodoxy of the time. People like Athanasius Kircher and St. Robert Bellarmine. And he placed the emphasis of existence in the human mind as opposed to in being itself, right? He said, cogito ego ergo sum, whereas an Aristotelian like Kircher would have said something like esse essens, I am, or something more to the extent of I am that I am. He starts with human thought and human conception as the beginning of all things, whereas the saner, frankly, philosophers start it with being in itself. You can't think unless you already exist. That would at least be my reasoning around it. And Peter Kreeft reiterates this quite strongly in his Modern Scholar series on St. Thomas Aquinas. And this led to I don't want to say that this led simply to the entire collapse of Western civilization, because there's a lot more to it. The economic circumstances that resulted from the Industrial Revolution certainly did not help, and neither did the constant subversion of society by people who are frankly interested in the destruction of that society. But it's still an incredibly important part, because he has taken the emphasis off of being itself, which Aquinas, for example, in the Summa Theologia, he writes the prima pars essentially on being itself, which is God. He moves it and places the emphasis on man. He also does a funny thing in that he hews the material part of man from the immaterial part. He makes mind and body and forms what is commonly called dualism, and I once held to this. I once held to Cartesian dualism when I was an atheist. And this, of course, produces the very famous mind-body problem, which Aquinas, in fact, solved by saying that man is form and matter, and that these things are intuitively linked, and that because of this fact, the fact that the human being is both soul, spirit, and body, and there is like I think Aristotle specifically talks about a third substance called spirit that links soul and body. I can't remember exactly, but essentially it resolves the connection between mind and body by intuitively associating them together. One cannot really exist without the other. You can't be a human being without the form of being a human, right? And the matter can't exist without some sort of form. Whereas Descartes hews them both essentially inseparably in two. Now, most ideas will often take 2 to 3 generations to, if they're picked up, to truly take effect. Right? You see this throughout history. For example, with the Council of... I suppose you'd give the second count. There's about 2 generations between Nicaea and First Constantinople. There's roughly 2 generations between First Constantinople and, was it Ephesus, the Theotokos one? I can't remember. Either way, the Christological councils are that sort of 4th, 5th century time when so much Christian doctrine was cleared up, that was usually done in two generation or one generation bounds, because the ideas, of course, have to proliferate through society. And this indeed happened with Descartes, and this led to Hume. Now, Hume outright denied causality. He outright denied causality. I can't remember exactly why. I think it's because he didn't believe that we could... Actually, I'm mixing up Kant in my head. He believed in experience alone, so we couldn't reason causation, if I remember correctly. And this led to the next very important figure, that was Immanuel Kant, because Immanuel Kant also saw other aspects of Hume's philosophy which he didn't like, namely the empirical aspects. So, to explain empiricism, in essence, empiricism states that you can only learn from the world. You can only learn through experience, be it picking up a book and reading it, or through doing, which is something that has carried through extraordinarily successfully into Anglo culture. There's always an emphasis on practicality, doing, like whacking things away. But after Hume, I believe it was about one or two generations afterwards, you had Immanuel Kant trying to respond. And indeed, Hume was separated by Descartes by, I think, 3 generations. Now Kant believed the opposite, essentially. You come to things, generally speaking, through a priori judgment before you reach them. And he created German idealism. But the real key factor here, like I'm not here obviously to give you a full explanation of their entire philosophy, because it's not necessary. I'm trying to zero in on the particular ideas. Kant denied that you could know things in themselves. He so distrusted, as a reaction to Hume's empiricism, which also strangely denied causation. I assume because causation is like post hoc realization, rationalization. He outright denied that you could know things in themselves. So, for example, this would mean that you could never know 100% for certain that an apple is an apple in itself. You can come to a conclusion that it's 99.999%. It essentially makes it probabilistic, as opposed to being able to know something is absolutely true, which of course plays havoc with so many different things. So you not only have a problem of denial of causation, which of course breaks cosmological arguments, which I do believe Kant actually made. I'm mixing Hume and Kant here. I should be more clear in what I'm saying, right? I don't have a script in front of me. So Hume's denial of causation breaks cosmological arguments. Now, granted, he had a really silly idea, a reason for breaking causation, because to deny causation would be to deny your own senses. But then you have Kant saying, oh, we can't know things in themselves, which which nullifies the senses even more, even though Hume put them first. Now, from what I understand, Kant only applied this particular thing in 4 categories. Now, Hegel came along and applied it to everything. He applied it to political theory, and he even applied it to theology. For example, replacing God the Father with what is known as the Absolute Spirit, which is very strange. And we see this manifested, especially in his historical philosophy, where he believed the Prussian state was the epitome of all states, which was obviously just a power grab. Someone like E. Michael Jones knows a lot more about the specifics in this part. But then you see this spring out of Marx. Springing out of it, you see Marx, who applies materialism to this from, I believe it's Feuerbach. And that's about as far as we really need to go. I think I've established the genealogy here. We've essentially got the biggest thinkers in Western philosophy post about 1630, believing that the human being is essentially hewed away from reality, in terms of how he can experience with his senses or through his realization, his rationalization of it. In fact, funny I should mention rationalism, that's what Kant held to. Isn't Hegel like the father of modern-day fascism? Hegel is the father of most modern philosophy. Oh, is my mic volume doesn't go any higher. My apologies. I will turn it up if I can. Okay, I moved it closer to me, sorry. I understand that I've not given the most clear explanation here, but you've got to remember I'm dealing with things that are very complex, and I don't have a script in front of me. I'm just trying to get out these specific problems. So, where does the modern person find himself? Now, of course, things have developed since then. You have the emergence of logical positivism, which is ridiculous. And you have the emergence of postmodernism, which doesn't even deal with metaphysics, really. But you also actually have some interesting reactions, like Paul Feyerabend's epistemic anarchism, which I think is a much more sane view of reality than logical positivism. I should probably posit what logical positivism is. Essentially, the manifestation that we see most of this particular philosophical school would be scientism. Logical positivism is more about trying to narrow down what we can't answer as opposed to what we can. I wouldn't say design, but it is there to narrow down scientific questions, narrow down questions which we can answer through science. And scientism says that we can only answer any question through science. When people say, oh, this is anti-science, they are generally implicitly following this ideology. Now, the problem, of course, with scientism is that the scientific method isn't scientifically proven. It also is very difficult to scientifically test for history. But people still read it anyway, right? I mean, maybe not the sorts of people who are unironically scientistic. But yeah, you see the problem. It doesn't work. And likewise, logical positivism excludes so many questions about human existence that it's essentially useless. QWERTY says, logical positivism was laughed out of civil political discussion less than 30 years after it was positive. Few schools of thought are outright debunked rather than abandoned. Yeah. It just narrowed down the questions so much that it's essentially useless. For those who have a more Aristotelian way of viewing things, it essentially talks about material causation and not much else. But even then, being a product of the Enlightenment, it denies causation, so hey-ho. You see, the problem with narrowing down these ideas, right, is that very few people actually hold a pure view of any of these things. 90% of people don't even know what I'm talking about. And to a large extent, even I don't know what I'm talking about. Funnily enough. But I know enough of it to know that it's a problem. So let's revisit the list. Now that we have explained in a very free-form way, I'll say, like, this isn't getting a good grade if it's a presentation for a philosophy module, because that's not the intent. But let's renew how these things link into the things that I read earlier on. I want to get into the second part more than anything, because I think this is the way that people are going to do more prevailing, and I'm a lot better read on this sort of thing. The destruction of marriage. Well, if the two can't become one flesh, because one can't even become one flesh, really, because of the hewing of the spirit, of the mind from the body. Well, how can two become one flesh? That in a specifically Christian view. And more than that, the fact that human beings are disconnected from reality by virtue of these things. I'm sorry, the dog is whining. I'm going to be a second. Come on, girl. Come on, go up again. See, I told you she'd do this. She also stings. So where was I? Yeah. Marriage, right? You've not only made it very difficult for human beings to rationalize their own minds with their own bodies, which leads to other problems which I won't mention. I'm sure you can think of what I'm talking about. It also means that people can just have their own conceptions of marriage and, hey ho. The destruction of objective standards of behaviour. Well, you see, this is set up really well in Alistair McIntyre's book After Virtue. Because virtue ethics essentially posits that there are objective standards and objective faculties of human beings that can be maximised and perfected. Now, if you have the human being necessarily hewed from his environment, right? His mind is separate from his body, right? And he doesn't even know if the real world is the real world, right? There's always a probability with knowing things, right? Like, actually, this is something that really, really ticks me off, right? As somebody who's going into a master's degree in artificial intelligence, right? Well, computational intelligence, but same thing. You have these artificial intelligence people talking about philosophy in terms of probabilities as opposed to absolutes, and it really gets under my skin, right? And they'll think that they're being very humble by saying, "Oh, there's a 99.9% certainty I exist." He. Like no, that's just obfuscation and buying into the same error. So if you're a person who's fundamentally hewn in two and you can't possibly for certain know his own world that he is dwelling in, then how can he be certain of, first of all, his own perception of truth, and second of all, his own faculties? You can't work on your own faculties if you don't know they exist. Or you've provided a gigantic disincentive from doing so because the person isn't certain. Thirdly, the tyranny of pathos. Well, since we've essentially debunked the ability for people to know reality in itself, what do you appeal to? Because you can't appeal to absolute truth, because that can't really exist and no human being can really know it. You appeal to pathos. And increasingly, as society has this strange egalitarianism spreading through it, you can't really appeal to authority or ethos either, right? Every person's opinion is as good as any other's. You can't say, point to the Bible and say, abortion is bad. Because, that was just written by a guy. And not only a guy that wasn't writing last Thursday, a guy that was writing in 1000 BC. His opinion is just the same as mine. The difference is that I have the internet. And pathos is incredibly easy to control if you know how human beings function, which, interestingly enough, you have to actually go back to these philosophers to learn about the lower passions. The destruction of meaningful education. Now, it's taken a few years for it to really get in earnest, but we are currently in that environment. In fact, even St. John Henry Newman, writing in the 19th century, used to say that the 3-4 years that people spent at university for men would be better off just... The students would be better off just being left to their own devices to go and find books. The quality of the education was so bad, at least he thought. And having completed my bachelor's degree, I can very strongly agree. If the only objective benefit that university gave me, aside from all of the lovely people that I've met, was that I had assignments to complete and exams to study for. Aside from that, and aside from some very select situations, for my bachelor's, it was essentially just Google. It was just Google and grunting it out. Descartes couldn't demonstrate a certain reality. Hume couldn't present it at all. Yeah, I mean, another thing, right? I'm not so comfortable with the modern philosophers because I haven't really spent that much time obsessing over them. But I have spent some time looking into the philosophers that essentially mirror mirror their views, and a lot of them get their views from, right? So Schopenhauer had a real interest in Heraclitus, for example, who believed that there was no such thing as being, only change. Okay, so what's changing then? If there's no being, what particular entities are changing then, Heraclitus? And then you have, on the other side, people like Parmenides, and you have Zeno, who believe that there is only being and no change. In other words, this kind of pantheism. And Aristotle and Plato go after these far better than I ever could. Aristotle goes after them in his Metaphysics. Now, this is a book that you cannot listen to on audio tape. It's too complicated. But essentially, both are really silly, and Hume imitates Parmenides and Zeno, whereas Schopenhauer and others imitate Heraclitus, and they sort of spring between these weird extremes, and really the only sensible option is to go somewhere in the middle like Plato and Aristotle did. The atomization of society and divergence of societal aims. Well, again, another interesting development politically is this belief in the individual, so you've destroyed the family. And another thing that Aristotle in his Politics says is the basis of all society. Not only that, you've hewed the person in two. Aquinas, in fact, says that in De Regno that the human being is a microcosm of the family, is a microcosm of the state. Or the country. I can't remember exactly what term he uses. He probably didn't use the word state. Now, if you've completely destroyed the human being, like Descartes essentially did, and split him without resolving the mind-body problem, then what's going to happen to the family? Yeah, I'm not surprised. There's icons of Aristotle elsewhere as well. Championing word games. Now, if you've destroyed objective truth, then all there really is power. Pursuing worldly things. Because if you learn the truth, you learn that life is about pursuing and loving Christ. In a very literal sense. So what is left if you cannot pursue truth because you can't know truth? Well, there remains sex. There remains emotional satisfaction. There remains pursuing wealth. There remains power. The most compelling of these is power, probably, because the famous saying, everything is about sex except for sex, which is about power. And so you're not going to have so many people in churches if they don't believe that it's subjectively true, or they don't think that they can believe it's true. The whole point of this presentation is to reinforce the fact that these religions, in their inception and right now, have object, physical, meaning, and manifestation. Because that is the flaw. I mean, at least these sorts of atheists who are on YouTube profess to believe something. Apatheists are just like, well, I can't know. That's not good enough. And it's in fact tremendously annoying. Because, if you're how could you not care about the most important question? How could you not? And just claim, oh, I don't know, I'm going to get on with my life. Still, it's something that, I mean, even as an atheist, I remember very distinctly when I was about 17, having an argument with a friend of mine who was both Sikh and Catholic at the same time. And I was like, you realise that these two things, they're mutually exclusive. And I was going on at him for about an hour, and he just would not budge, and I couldn't understand it. It's like, why wouldn't you care about, the most important question? And why would you accept a compromise that doesn't make logical sense? And it's the same thing with these apatheists, you're willing to not care about the most important question? Like I've said, 2 billion abortions, right? You've hewed... You see the trend I'm getting at here. Now, let's go on to the bit where I talked about rewriting history. There was a massive rewrite of history, and there have been books written about this. I haven't read the specific books on the retconning of history, but I do know the history in itself beforehand, because I went and sought out the medieval sources for certain things. especially relating to miracles. Now, one of the very common 20th century attacks on religion was suggesting, oh, all of these religious ceremonies, all of these prayers, I think it may have even been Sigmund Freud that said this, they're all just psychological suggestion. Okay. So what suggestion is, oh, you're basically just repeating these things over and over each other and insisting you believe it. You don't really believe. Okay. Whoops a daisy. Wrong one. I just doxed myself. Well, I doxed my old alma mater there. Okay. So you've got your psychological suggestion. It's all just suggestion, though. Yeah, suggest that. Suggest that. That is a Eucharistic miracle. Eucharistic miracles are where the body and blood of Christ turns into literal body and blood. Now, in Catholic theology, there are two parts, in fact, reflecting this this form and matter dichotomy previously to the Eucharist. There's the species and the substance. The substance in the Eucharist generally changes. There are like 6 in Poland, Kinshoto. Generally speaking, the substance in the Eucharist changes, but the species remains the same. And that's where you still see the bread and the wine. The parts of them that are actually bread and wine are known as accidents. However, occasionally, what will happen is if you have a disbelieving priest or something like that, it will start to bleed. Yes, I do believe this, because it's happened dozens of times. And they've tested the blood as well. And interestingly, they're always AB blood type. It's always repeatedly the same thing. Every single time. Now, this shocks the secular person because their entire history has been retconned. Do you think that it was just Thomas Jefferson who ripped all the miracles out of the Jefferson Bible? No, it was much more than that. You had people like Gibbon who retconned history. Now, the difference is that it was very easy for the professors of the Enlightenment to retcon history because most of the history was written in Latin. I actually don't think I don't actually think I doxed myself because it didn't show. I'm going to go back in this room a little bit. Yeah, I didn't. Okay. So, because most of the history was written in Latin. And the Protestant reformers, after some time, of course not immediately, a lot of Martin Luther's works and Melanchthon, in fact, that's the Latinization of his real surname, which was Schwarzerd. These believed in Latin, but as time went on, the vernacular languages started to develop in Europe, particularly in England and particularly in Germany. And they viewed Latin as being access to popery. And so they missed out on these huge, extensive hagiographies, these huge histories that had been written in the Middle Ages. And indeed, just reams and reams and volumes of history that talked about miracles. And when there were miracles in other works, the one that springs to mind is one of the oracles in Herodotus' histories who talks to the king of Lydia. That's a very interesting story. Actually, I'll tell that right now, because that's an interesting story, and it illustrates a point where prophecy has been incredibly important. So the king of Lydia was having problems with the king of Persia. The king of Persia was, of course, Cyrus the Great, and at this point, Cyrus wasn't as ascendant as he would become. And they're going to battle against each other. And the king of Lydia goes to an oracle. I don't think it was Delphi. And they said, and the oracle said that the mule, the empire that was ran by a mule would win the battle, because he was about to fight some big battle. And he was like, okay, so neither side is ruled by a mule, so that means that I'm going to win, because Lydia at that point, I believe, was more powerful than the Persians. I don't think the Persians had even really dealt with the Medians at that point. Now, in the battle, the king of Lydia loses and dies. And the catch on the prophecy, as often happens in classical Greek literature, turns out that the mule was Cyrus, because Cyrus was biracial. No, specific denominations don't use the Jefferson Bible. It's just an example of the retconning of history. So what the Enlightenment did is, first of all, it started, all of these miracles, it's popish nonsense. And then they said, it's it's stuff that primitive people believed. That's how the Enlightenment treated history, and eventually over time, not only did they remove parts of the history, Gibbon being one of the best examples of this, but they also belittled it, and they made it fashionable to belittle things like miracles. And this is, you can see it on the screen, right? This is one of the examples of things that they would belittle, and they completely removed it from history, and they completely removed any reference to the supernatural from history. Now, the trouble is they weren't completely able to do this, and they actually couldn't completely do this, because Christ played such an incredibly large role in history, and if there was anything that was supernatural, it was Christ. Let alone strange things like... there was one point, I believe it was under the Byzantine Emperor Heraclitus, he was facing off against a rival to the throne. I think he may have even already been emperor. And they're about to do a single duel, or a battle over the throne, and one of the opponents just drops dead. Right, just completely struck down like that. But more than that's one of the examples they couldn't really eliminate. But more than that, they completely eliminated the stories of the Catholic saints. Aren't mules sterilized? I mean, there were some interesting things that happened in the Persian Empire. Yeah, Guadalupe would factor into this as well. The trouble is that there are so many miracles that it would literally... I would run out of books writing them down that have happened in the thousands of years that the world has existed. For example, not just these Eucharistic miracles. You have Our Lady of Fatima, who I talked to a secular person about this, and they said, it was 3 shepherd children that saw it. Yeah, they were the ones that saw Our Lady. However, 75,000 people saw the sun dancing, and that particular miracle has repeated itself, even in Rome. 75,000 people, and secular newspapers were writing about the sun dancing. This is not a meme. Constantina, in hoc signo vinces, that's another one. Another one they don't really like to talk about, and, I've been belittled for believing these things, but to be honest, like I've said to the people who belittle me for believing these things, if they just want to reject these things as if they don't exist, then it's actually an arrogant thing to do to reject those things, because they are present in the historical record in abundance. There are entire categories of saints that have had the stigmata spontaneously appear on them. Padre Pio, for example, one of the most recent ones. There is, of course, St. Francis of Assisi. You also had these saints that could live off nothing but the Eucharist for 10 years. In fact, there were recent ones who have lived on it for 50. Nothing but the Eucharist. Body and blood once a day. Now, what's that? 300 calories, maybe? You would die very quickly if this was something completely natural. Yet, this has happened. Now, the example that springs to mind is St. Catherine of Siena. They don't factor into a secular view of history. You also have the saints that levitated. St. John of the Cross, St. Teresa of Avila. In fact, one of them, St. Philip Neri, had to actively stop himself praying during Mass because he would levitate during the Mass. You have St. Mary of Egypt as well. Older example, but nonetheless. And in fact, probably the biggest example is how every diocese has an exorcist, and how there are orders of exorcists running around. Do they keep these people on the payroll just to convince unintelligent people, or do they solve an actual role? Do they serve a role? Martha Robin, yeah, that's the one I'm thinking of. CL. She survived off the Eucharist for 50 years. Nothing but the Eucharist. But this is not rational. This is not reasonable in the way that the Enlightenment philosophers thought, because they thought they could do everything on natural reason. Now, ignore the fact that going back to classical reason had classical consequences, namely the genocide in the Vendée. But we don't talk about that. Not to mention the cataclysmic wars that we now have. They don't pay attention to these things. These things decidedly happened. And they'll say, oh, there's no peer-reviewed study. Well, you're not going to peer review history, are you? In the same way that you're going to peer review a scientific paper. They'll say these things are anti-science, right? And they certainly lie outside of the realm of science, but they are not. They exist in reality. And by science, I mean empirical science, right? I don't mean science in the original sense of the word, which just means a body of knowledge, right? Scientia. These things do happen. Another one, Our Lady of Good Success, which it doesn't actually mean that in Spanish, but I'll call it that anyway. Our Lady, the Mother of God, appears to a nun in Ecuador in the early 17th century, I believe it was 1610, and starts talking about the domination of strange sects in the 1960s. In the 1960s, 350 years after they happen. After this happens, right? And what do you think that now, for example, there is a good reason to be critical of these sorts of things. For example, the medieval historians had a particular habit of embellishing miracles. For example, I have a book on St. Ephrem the Syrian where the medieval hagiographers would add all sorts of crazy over-the-top miracles. But the thing is that these things do happen. They are they're an omnipresent reality in the historical record. These saints. There are 27,000 of them. And a good chunk of them have miracles. A lot of them are martyrs, but a good chunk of them have miracles. In fact, since I believe it was 1582, when I want to say, I won't try and name the Pope. He established the cause of the Congregation of Rights, right? And this was changed into the cause for the Congregation for the cause of Saints, right? And this essentially regulated the canonization process, and these required demonstrable miracles for saints to be canonized. For example, strange things like the spontaneous disappearing of brain tumors. These things that the doctors themselves will admit are not explainable through natural means. And that's what I mean by the retconning of history, because this has been happening for 300 years, and they just deny it, right? They deny it, and a lot of the time they will deny it for dishonest means. For example, I recall Charles Colomb talking about a man who had a problem with levitating furniture in his house in one of the California valleys. And this atheist journalist wrote, of course, an article mocking it. And so the man who owned the house wrote back to the paper and said to the journalist, well, you can come here and you can see this levitating this levitating furniture for yourself. Come on. I don't have to do anything. And the guy wrote another article essentially refusing to, and from what Colomb said, he essentially said, well, I'm not going to change my worldview this late in life. Or they won't even do that. They'll just belittle it, and they'll be like, lol, are you a child for believing these things? Well, I mean, it takes a special kind of hardening of the heart to ignore, potentially hundreds of thousands of miracles. At strange times in history as well, strangely relevant times of history as well. In fact, I would actually say that those people who... I mean, I can understand why you wouldn't want to read into it, because it can often get pretty spooky. But at the same time, to deny the ontological existence of these things is ridiculous. Okay, so we're going to take some questions now. Actually, no, I've got one more section. Now, we've established what has happened with the philosophy that has led to atheism, the consequences of atheism, and we've talked about the retconning of history. What do we do about it? Now, the tendency in traditional circles is to be, understandably, very afraid. Anyone can claim anything is a miracle. How do you know who's lying? Well, I'm sorry, but if there are hundreds of thousands of examples, and the religion tells people that lying about these sorts of things is a serious sin, I'm going to assume that at least some of them are true. And a lot of the time, for example, with the tilma from Our Lady of Guadalupe, which was a garment made out of, or a garb that was made out of, I think it was cactus, which was supposed to rot, which normally rotted away 15 to 20 years after it was made, right? This tilma has lasted 500 years, people accidentally pouring acid on it, and people literally dynamiting it. This is objective reality here. This is what apatheists and atheists do not understand. These religious ideas, they are not just like fancy hold hands colours of uniform in the factory kind of stuff. This is objective truth we are playing around with, objective physical truth. Do you think that the accounts of bilocating saints were possible? Well, apparently Our Lady did it. Our Lady of the Pilar, and apparently St. Alphonsus Liguori did it. So I don't know. I just know that there are clearly things that transcend purely natural laws in this world. But in terms of reacting to atheism and reacting to this apatheism, right? A lot of these people are so blinded by their own error that they will never listen to what I've said. They will claim that anybody presenting these truths to them is nuts, and the society will accept it. So they've got no real material reason to accept anything that I'm saying. And, they're lost. Right? I recall Father John Harden specifically saying the new paganism, as he calls it, is so it hews human beings so far from reality that it's almost impossible to convert them, and that it requires a real act of grace for it to happen. I don't know if he was right. I'm just saying. But this whole thing has consumed the world. And what I don't like, what I'm seeing, and what other people have pointed out, and what I don't like, is that I see traditional Catholic communities starting to do what the evangelicals did in the 1990s. Overly emphasizing the homeschooling aspect, trying to perhaps viciously attack atheism in an uncharitable way. Just kind of create this suburban bubble of people who are scared. Now, we cannot be afraid we cannot be afraid. We cannot be afraid of these things. We know that these things have happened. I can understand Mary appearing to someone or bleeding host, but why would God levitate furniture? The answer is that God wasn't. There was an exorcist there. Now, we can hide from the culture, because I understand that I'm going to, and I have succeeded in convincing exactly nobody through this stream. I'm pretty certain of that anyway. Right? I was explicitly told when I mentioned this that I was being anti-science on Facebook. I was told that I was alienating people through insisting on the object physical proof of my religion, which, I'm very blunt with people. I don't play word games, and I'm not a particularly nice person. But at the same time, if you state the truth to someone, you tell them, look, you can take it or leave it, right? And they give you that, oh, you're being hostile or whatever, oh, you're making your religion look bad, right? It's like, well, okay. You're not going to convert these people. I'm not convinced that. I think it would take a miracle to convert most people, and it is a miracle every time it happens. I know it's a miracle in my case, right? But it's understandable. It's understandable to be scared. Be not afraid. Another thing. Political solutions will never work, because the majority of people in the modern world do not believe this, right? Very quickly, people realize that if you live in a representative democracy, you can control the society in two ways. First of all, through controlling the political parties, and second of all, and therefore the representatives, and second of all, through controlling the vote. Now, this has always been the case with the parties. The parties have always been controlled by the elite, the intellectual, the cultural, and the economic elites. This is just how it was always been, right? That's how merchant republics always worked, like the United States. But the populace at large has often been a lot harder. But with the invention of things like public relations, crystallizing public opinion by Bernays, I think that was written in 1928, evil books like that, they have also been able to push this sort of thing on the lower down people very effectively as well. And so they've also rigged the voters with many false ideas. And so I don't think that political solutions will work. One of the approaches that I think will work eventually will be the approach of Opus Dei, founded by Saint Jose Maria Escriva. And they focus on converting these cultural elites. And this is not gonna sit well with the average. I mean, nothing I've said here is gonna sit well with the average person in the modern world. But unfortunately, it's not the masses that change reality. It's a set of determined minorities. It was a set of determined minorities that stopped this society being Christian, and it's going to be a set of determined minorities that are going to make this society Christian again. And Jose Maria Escriva realised this and set up Opus Dei for the upper middle class and higher class people, the people who have the control. Now, that's not to say that we shouldn't, of course, evangelise the poor. Of course we should. They are in the likeness and image of God and loved just as much. And don't ever forget that. However, the people on top have a greater level of influence. And so Opus Dei is going to focus on them. It happened the same way in the Roman Empire as well. Of course, in a much blunter way, Constantine the Great, of course, moved his capital to Constantinople, made the palace Christian, and then it spread out from there. It became the new orthodoxy. And this also happened across England with the different kingdoms. It started with Augustine of Canterbury converting the King of Kent, and then going out from there. So I think if there's going to be a political solution, there's not going to be a political solution in a direct way. It's going to involve converting the upper classes. And that's not going to happen if we keep suspecting authority, if we keep undermining our Pope, if we keep just rejecting the modern world in every single way, right? And I'm as guilty of this as any of you, right? I've been skeptical of things in the modern world. I've said things that are ridiculous, right? But at the same time, you can't just ignore it. Does the blood still have the properties of wine? The wine is there is still accidents of the wine there, yeah. We cannot afford to hide. Now, my entire approach to this is to be honest, not very poor and not very good, and I don't think I'd advocate for this approach. And my approach has been essentially to bold-facedly state the truth as the truth, and if people don't like it, then they can give or take. And that's frankly because I have come from atheism. I am still very angry that I've been lied to in such a way, and I want to get people out of it. And I do not know how you can really sit and convince a large crowd of people very quickly without just bluntly telling them the truth. Because otherwise, it's situations where you're sitting down with a person and explaining to them, which I'm fine to do. I'm happy to do that, but I don't know of... I know of a couple of people that it's worked on. But when I'm talking in a group of people, then I just have to bluntly state it. You can't do the same individual, tweaking of things when you're working with a large group. Now, there are some approaches that you could take, like rewiring the what they call stereotypes that have been instilled in people through public relations. Now, I don't know how effective this is because I don't have a collection of the stereotypes, and I don't think I ever will have one. But that could be an approach. Likewise, you could also just start producing lots of cultural content, writing books and such. I've thought of writing books, but frankly, I don't have any immediate need to, and I can't motivate myself to. And I think that if I were to write a book, it would be largely out of vanity at this point. I'm a 22-year-old man. I don't really know anything. You could... I mean, there are as many ways to evangelize as there are... saints. There are largely... I mean, of course, they vary. You mix them together. But I know that's really not my strong suit. So yeah, I'm going to wait for you guys to stick questions in the chat. I've noticed a ton of them, but my mouth is very dry, which is why I've been somewhat distracted. I've been going on for an hour and 5 minutes with essentially no script and just some notes. So I'll be back in a second, lads. Also, I was just grabbing the water there. It just occurred to me that one of the main approaches I've had is to try and live the most virtuous life as I can, and that does work. That does work very well. In fact, that's Pope Francis's advice. But yeah, let's look for the questions, because I can see that there are a lot. A huge list. I guess I've gotten a lot of people in here. What are your thoughts about the conflation of the mind and the soul? The mind is undeniably immaterial, but it can't account for the form of humanness. Well, I believe it's Aristotle's Diana talks about this, right? Because sensitive souls in dogs, emotional souls are part of the physical attributes of a person. So, for example, your temperament comes out of your physical body. Likewise, memory comes out of your physical body. But the immaterial aspects of the mind, that being the intellect and will, are immaterial. Angels have these as well. Let's see. Do you get annoyed about atheists and scientists explain morality and good behaviour through evolution? Well, I mean, I assume you're referring to Sam Harris's book, which is like, well, you can test to find out what's a good morality. Well, I mean, the problem with this is that you still have to make assumptions somewhere. You have to assume what is good and what is bad, and there's actually one particular fellow in UKIP who is very, very capitalistic, and I actually challenged this once, partly to see what happens, but partly because I believe it's true as well. Now, of course, capitalists believe that economic growth and economic prosperity is a good thing, and I decided, well, I'll make an argument against economic prosperity and say it's a bad thing because it reduces the virtue of the people in the society. And they did not like that being challenged one bit. Well, he didn't like that being challenged one bit. And I think that's the problem with someone like Sam Harris, right? If you were to challenge something basic, say freedom is a bad thing, right? And say that increasing freedom is a bad thing. Now, I'm not saying that I believe this. Of course I don't believe this. But watch them freak out. But the thing is that the book, that's what it's called, The Moral Landscape. The moral landscape doesn't take account for questions like this. And it can't. How much of this can be traced to Protestantism, and which denomination specifically? I mean, you could say that a lot of the English empiricism came out of Calvinism, but it's you see, a lot of it isn't a strictly Protestant problem, because a lot of the intellectual elites in Protestant countries ceased to be Christian. For example, John Milton was an Arian. The guy that translated the Antiquities of the Jews by Josephus, whose name is slipping my mind, and I'm mixing him up with Benjamin Jowett, who translated Plato. He was another Arian. Newton was some sort of Arian as well, or some sort of strange. He had some sort of strange view on the Trinity. Okay, let's see. We should have the DNA from the miracle blood, right? Have there been any papers written about this? Have we catalogued the genome of the miracle blood? I don't know, but I know that you can test it and it is indeed blood and it has a blood type AB. There aren't denominations that use the Jefferson Bible. I think I answered that when it came out, though. Aren't mules sterile? Well, I mean, you could read a lot more into into the prophecy of these oracles, but that's a pagan oracle. Let's see. I've answered the bilocating saints question. I'm scrolling down and it's going to stick to the bottom. If most people don't live their life in accordance with Catholic doctrine, why is it so hard to believe a bunch of people who would just lie about levitating furniture and what have you? Well, why would they lie about levitating furniture? People immediately assume that you're some sort of superstitious idiot if you talk about levitating furniture. Although it often does come from people who are apostatizing, and that's actually directly linked to these sorts of things. There's a reason why this sort of thing pops up in horror movies, and it's because it's not accountable. You can't take account of it using the modern worldview, but you can with older ones. Let's see. How do you think the divide of individualists and collectivists in the US can be fixed? I don't know, just have more children. What are your thoughts on continental philosopher Graham Harman going back to realism and Aristotle? That's a good thing. I think it's a good thing. I think that even though a lot of these modern philosophers are so steeped in anti-Christianity that they won't be able to do that, at the very least, a trajectory in the direction of returning to actual intellectual Christianity is a good thing. Oh, here we go again. Middle Eastern religion. Well, I mean, it could have come from North Korea. If it's true, it's true. I don't care if it's not of my culture. If it's true, I will follow it. And if my culture doesn't like it, then my culture can, take a hike. I don't know how much traction Bishop Barron's content would get here, but I'm unique with Catholic approach, and suitable today is to start with beauty. I assume that... I think that would work. Because the thing is that the world is so ugly. It's so disgustingly ugly. And there have been people who have intentionally pushed it to be so. Do you think that we are used to taking some ideas of our age in a way similar to how the Church Fathers did with the Hellenistic? Yeah, we're going to have to. I don't think that's going to happen by default. Mark Hansen. Well, I mean, I think I answered your question. Well, I think it was the one on... I've lost it. If you repeat it, you can tell me if I've answered it or not. The Graham one, repeat it again. Is it a good idea to study law, especially since our legal system seems to become... I don't know. I mean, if you're going to study something at university, make sure it's economically viable. Or economically viable, whatever it's pronounced as. It's a Middle Eastern Semitic religion. Yeah, it is a Middle Eastern Semitic religion. And if it's true, it's true. Our paganisms were not true, so we don't follow them. You know, the very last thing that your ancestors as pagans chose to do as pagans was to be baptized. Why did that video about BookTube made private? Because I scandalised people in it by I scandalised people in it, and I regretted it. So I decided that I would stop the scandalising. Thanks, Metaphysics. Although this one is a lot more out there than most of my streams, because a lot of the time I'll try and keep it within the bounds of. You see, it's so hard to get an idea of whether what you're saying is grounded and reasonable, because the entire culture is insane. So I don't know how I'm doing. Do you like Middle Eastern Orthodox? Yeah, like the. I like the Arabic version of the Agni Partheni chant. I thought Newton was straight up esoteric. Yeah, he was a Gnostic, I thought. But he also had views on Christ, of course. A lot of these sort of intellectual types, even in the 16th century, were Gnostics. I won't name them though. I haven't read that book by Michael Jones, and I'm not going to read out the title because I'll get flagged. I also don't really intend on reading it. I don't think there's any real need. Let's see. Questions in here. Can people who haven't been baptized commit mortal sin? Yes, they can. Basil the Second. Oh, is it Basil the Second, the one that dropped dead? Okay, my mistake. Sorry, my friend was asking me about a particularly popular history channel on YouTube and its videos on Christianity. Suffice to say, the people who run it are they're best ignored. I'll say that. I mean, the thing with YouTube is that you're not going to get the greatest definition on things, and you can see this from the stream that I've presented to you here, because I've tried to articulate the historical context of a lot of these things, and I stumbled over my words a lot because I don't have a script. And I tried to go over it in a kind of free-handed kind of way, and it don't work because it's something that's really, really complicated. Right, so let's see if there are any Christians. Any Christians? Any questions? I know that I've missed a ton. How did the medievals evangelize? Well, you see, the Franciscans did it through living an apostolically poor life, and that appealed to people in the Middle Ages. They also did it in Muslim lands by dying a lot. The Dominicans did it through logical argument, and they were less effective. At least according to my Franciscan professor friend. Let's see. Every single politician is a wealthy person claiming to be a working man. Yeah, even in the case of your profile picture, CL, Hilaire Belloc. The crucifix that was in the way was completely bent back and destroyed. Oh yeah, this is QWERTY here is talking about the time that the Marxists tried to blow up the tilma from Our Lady of Guadalupe. The crucifix that was in the way was completely bent back, and it destroyed the marble stairs where the dynamite was placed, hidden in a flower arrangement. The image of Our Lady of Guadalupe is miraculous because it wasn't damaged. They literally tried to pour... Well, they literally accidentally poured acid on the thing and it didn't get damaged. I think it actually recovered itself on its own. Like, it's insane, but it happened. Like, there are so many... In fact, one of the things that's so good about Scripture is that it makes constant reference to physical manifestation, right? Both the people of Egypt and the Israelites saw the pillar of fire. Right? They were continually building stacks of rocks. The Red Sea parted even, not the Dead Sea. You have constant appealing to obvious physical evidence. Now, the trouble with other religions, Islam for example, Mormonism, these are just things revealed to people, which can often be delusions. Both mental illness and preternatural. What are your current views on evolution? I don't think that evolution is sufficient. I mean, obviously, natural selection. I mean, obviously, there's an inheritance of certain traits, but it doesn't explain things like rational ensoulment. So I think that evolution could be a small piece of a much larger puzzle. I don't think it's sufficient to explain reality. I'm a proddy, but I'm not going to deny clear miracles. Yeah. I mean, it's more these sorts of atheist types who think that they are, frankly, more intelligent than these things. That I have the real problem with, because most people think that a large chunk of people, maybe not all people or a majority of people, but a substantial chunk of people will lift their nose up and think that you are some sort of child for making light of these things, and really that just comes out of pure arrogance. And I say this because I used to do so myself. Or rather, I should make it very clear that the reason that I am so vociferously against atheism, and the reason that I have said these things and pointed out the obvious problems with atheism in such harsh words, is because I laboured under this delusion myself for a very long time, and it made me miserable. The Dark Ages hypothesis is ridiculous. There are so many commentaries and Latin works from the early Middle Ages. Why does it happen if it's a disbelieving priest? I assume because Christ is like, okay, so you disbelieve in this, well, there you go, I'm going to save your soul. By shocking you. Why did the New Atheist movement die out? It didn't die out, it evolved. John Nathan says, are you still willing to do political debates, or do you think they're a waste of time? I don't think that anything really useful comes out of them except for getting more subscribers on the YouTube channel. I don't think that all of this mucking around with politics online is that useful. There's a reason why... I mean, I've made some interactions with the NRX people because I like them personally. But I don't think that they're going to be successful. So I just don't really stay out of it. Who are good historians who don't hide things like miracles and don't spread lies about saints and missionaries? Well, you see, you'd have to look into people like Charles Cologne. In the modern age, you'd be looking for very fringe figures, not because the historians are necessarily bad, although I've observed that 19th century history was better quality than modern history. It's more because they don't know that this exists. So you'd be looking at mostly very old history books. That would include people like I want to say Geoffrey of Windsor, but I know that's not his. Geoffrey of Monmouth, that would be one. The Kings of England. You could look into Hilaire Belloc. You could look into the historical works of G.K. Chesterton. There's a lot of them actually. The Acta Sanctorum by Baronius, if you can find the English translation of that, that's got a big collection of saints. There's a lot. There are all sorts of histories written by different people. Athanasius wrote a history of the Arians, although he was very anti-Arian, so you might be. Eusebius of Caesarea, Flavius Josephus. These are very old historians, though, and you would be like, I'll put it this way: Eusebius of Caesarea makes some very interesting claims in his books that I'm not sure I believe, like a letter written by Christ. But he's generally used as a source. There's all sorts of medieval histories lying around. A lot of them aren't translated. Let's see. Questions. It's a purely negative movement. Yeah, it was just there to destroy the evangelical movement, right? Because the trouble with a lot of the evangelicals and the trouble with a lot of people nowadays is that we just don't know our logical proofs. Like, I did a formal logic course and I can't recall much of it, but I know it was helpful to my conversion. All division in today's world is ultimately a division between materialism versus non-materialism, spiritualism. Yeah, you see, that the trouble is, and I've seen this happen, is that a lot of people will notice things like miracles happening, and then because there's absolutely no religious basis, they will fly into this spiritual, not religious kind of thing, and they will consequently lose their minds. Like, I know this guy who was on a very similar course to mine. Mine was computer science. His was computer engineering, I believe. And he discovered the sort of Zen Buddhism stuff, but it was really more New Agey. And he literally named himself after Prometheus and is really, really into David Icke. And some of the really strange, like, lizard people stuff. He really took a strange walk down the left-hand path. And that's the problem with the spiritualism, because, if you don't interpret these sorts of miracles through a rational, like an actual logical framework, then you will be led in all sorts of directions, because a lot of people are like, oh, pretty miracles, I want them, and rest assured they're provided them. But it doesn't end well for these sorts of people. They go insane. There's a reason why the Beatles went so nuts. It's because they started playing around with transcendental meditation, and that's playing around with that's playing with fire. In fact, actually, I believe it's a grave sin to do that, because it's channeling. Yeah. And you leave yourself open to all sorts of things. You've got to be very, very careful with any of this sort of any sort of this miracle spiritual stuff. You've got to be incredibly careful with it, right? It's got to be absolutely subservient to reason. We can accept that these things happen. We know that they happen, but that's not an excuse to go all out. Is anyone religious but not spiritual? Well, I'd say that the modern society is largely religious, not spiritual, because it has a rule of life, but it doesn't believe in the human spirit. Like, you see, it's very easy to get kind of irritated at the spiritual but not religious kind of women types, but really they're just tremendously miserable and they're looking for any meaning that they can eke out of their lives. You should take pity on them. And you see, the problem with my disposition is that I'm not very good at doing that. Yeah, I believe Ryan Reeves said that when Protestantism splintered in the 19th century, then its heart and mind was split between different denominations. Yeah. In fact, you see this with some of the conservative Lutherans who will make very strange comparisons and will talk about very strange things regarding the Pentecostal movements. They'll relate them to non-Christian heresies and non-Christian beliefs, and it's often very uncharitable. In fact, this Peter Burfeen guy I've been reading does this a little bit. Let's see. St. Bede's Ecclesiastical History of the English People. How could I have forgotten that? That's a good one. There are all sorts of different histories. A lot of them are these huge chronicles. For example, I got a Chronicle of English history and French history. I think it goes back to Hugh Capet for the French, and I think it goes back to, I want to say William the Conqueror, but I'm not sure because I don't have it on me. This huge chronicle which details every year from around about 1000 to 1530, and there's about 2,000 or 3,000 pages worth of information. And no one's going to read it, and I never sat down and read it. I really should sit down and read it, but there's all sorts of sources. There's the Nuremberg Chronicle, there's the Novgorod Chronicles, there's the Sukhov Chronicles if you want Russian history. There's all sorts of chronicles around. Anglicanism is just... I feel bad for Anglicans. This is one of the reasons why the Catholic Church is not going to schism. I mean, this is the thing. I think the trads need to calm down. Because, you see, I think if anyone's going to schism, it'll be the trads. I can't remember the exact name of the chronicle. But, that's another one. Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. There's all of these chronicles about, right? There are all of these about if you want to learn history. Now granted, they're kind of like the books of chronicles. They're often quite dry. Like reading the event log for a roguelike game. Let's see. Let's see. So, is there any other questions? Any final ones? Let's see if there are any left. Georges Sorel. Okay. Some mentionings of 20th century economic theorists. Don't know how that came up. So continental philosophy is a mistake like anime. Hegel wasn't just the father of modern day fascism, he was the father of fascism, full stop. Oh yeah, he essentially applied the categories theologians. Yeah, okay. Right. Would you say that Aquinas was the last great philosopher? No. No, there have been better well, maybe not better philosophers, but there have been very good philosophers after him. St. Robert Bellarmine, I was thinking of when I said better because he built on top of Aquinas. Edith Stein, St. Edith Stein is another interesting one. Jacques Maritain, Garrigou Lagrange. Actually, completely unrelated to this, it's just clicked into my head. At the University of Durham in Britain, they have an interesting program where they have Latinists go and translate scientific works from the Middle Ages, people like Grosseteste, and then give them over to modern scientists. And the general reaction is that the scientists are shocked at how much the professors and the scientists from the Middle Ages knew. Right? Now, this shouldn't surprise anyone, since with things like string theory, they're essentially copying out of the works of 2nd century Gnostics. But, yeah, suffice to say that there's nothing new under the sun. Would you consider debunking Sargon's new videos? No. No, I don't really need to. What are your discontents with modern psychology? Can you outline some of the things you have problems with? Well, first of all, it doesn't believe that human beings have a purpose. It's completely agnostic on that fact, and second of all, it denies the soul. Thirdly, it doesn't believe that culpability for sin has an influence on human thought. It's entirely focused on trying to fix a human being without making any ethical assumptions whatsoever, and assuming that the entire human being is just a physical thing, right? It all assumes that, unless you look at someone like Jung, and then it gets into strange Gnostic territory. And that's essentially why I think that the mental health industry in the West is in such a bad state, right? Because it's focused entirely on physical therapy and to a large extent validation. Obviously it varies by counsellor, but a lot of it is just validation. In fact, I've been to a few counsellors for various different things, and sometimes I will look at the counsellor after talking to him or her for about 10 minutes, and I will seriously think, I think you need more help than I do. What do you think of radical orthodoxy? I don't know what it is. Do you think that internet arguments are a waste of time? Well, it depends who you're talking to. If the person you are talking to or the audience is amenable to your beliefs, then they aren't. If your beliefs are true. But it really depends what you're discussing. Like this video here where I've talked about atheism and about physical evidence and retconning of history. Do I think it will convert anyone? Do I think it might have an influence? I don't know, but I suspect it won't. The reason I'm talking about it is out of a certain catharsis and to make very clear to people I was talking to yesterday where my position lies. Because they say, I'm a religious nut because I base all my political beliefs on my religion. I believe everything I live is through religion. And they are unable to understand why, because very few people do this. Will you continue the catechism videos? You see, the thing is with this channel is that I'm very disorganized, and I haven't been really organized since middle of October last year. So I have no idea. I should probably have some sort of plan, but really at the moment I'm just sort of treading water, I guess. Slightly off topic, but have you read The Font of Knowledge by St. John of Damascus or his other works? No, although it's a very, very good book, I've heard. It goes after Islam just after it was created, but it also goes after all sorts of heresies. It was one of the first works of systematic theology, if I understand. Aside from things like Origen, people like Origen even. Anyway, I think we're going to bring it to a close because we've been going for 1 hour and 37 minutes. My. Thank you very much for watching. I'm surprised that I've been able to hold 60 people here while I rant about bleeding hosts and Our Lady appearing to be. But hey, if people have found this useful, I hope that it's useful. I'll see you later, and goodbye.